that it may all sound like there's a lot of stuff there, but realistically, what it really means is that at the moment I work on issues that are at sort of the centre of issues to do with peace and security and human rights. And as mentioned, my work is in the UN as a secondee into the UN from the Australian government. Now, that said, just quickly, just to put a caveat up front, everything that I talk about today will be my own opinion and won't necessarily represent the opinion of the United Nations or alternatively of the Australian government. So I'm doing this obviously as a private citizen as opposed to those other sort of official roles. But that said, what I'll try to do is give a bit of an insight into some of the work that I have been doing and also some of the thoughts that I have around issues to do with human rights in the context of armed conflict. So look, my work at the moment really as the military expert on investigations of sexual exploitation and abuse focuses around providing the United Nations with a capability to develop an investigatory capability for member states. So there's a UN Security Council Resolution 2272 of 2016, and that resolution basically requires member states to deploy national investigation officers as part of their peacekeeping contingents to investigate allegations of sexual exploitation or abuse. And so as part of that, what my role is at the moment is to develop a training course that will train individuals from member states to become qualified investigations trainers, to then be able to return to their member states and qualify further people to be able to deploy to peacekeeping operations to be able to provide this particular type of capability. And really why that is important from a UN perspective is that issues to do with sexual exploitation and sexual abuse intersect so much of the other work that we do in terms of the peace and security pillar when it relates to protection of civilians, to children armed conflict and child protection, and issues to do with women, peace and security.
Oh. Stephanie, please. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, and issues to do with women, peace and security. So issues to do with sexual exploitation and sexual abuse intersect all of those thematic areas and obviously have a great impact upon the realisation of human rights and ultimately also the UN's efforts towards gender equality, which is specified by Sustainable Development Goal number 5. And so that's sort of where my work sits in there in terms of the UN. Yeah, do you have any further follow-up questions about that?
No, I think we'll talk about the other things as the other questions come up. But okay. Yeah, I mean, like, thank you for introducing what your work entails at the UN. And I think there's a lot work that you do which needs a lot of in-depth explanation or expansion, especially in terms of the training.
Can someone please remove? Thank you. Thank you. I believe she needs to be removed further.
Yes, please. Can we continue, Rahul?
Yes, please. I'm so sorry for that, Tyson.
That's all right. That was exciting.
She's there.
I just don't know who she is. I'm not allowing her, and I hold the admin controls for the meeting. I'm not allowing her. She's joining in herself.
Is it
so
some?
Sorry. Can someone please remove Stephanie? I don't know how to do this.
I hope it's not some hacker or something.
I'm so sorry. Please continue. I'll make sure that she's kept out.
No worries.
Really sorry for that.
Sure.
Yep. I mean, it's interesting, like you talk about all the trainings that you work at and how you frame them and even end up looking into how the people need to be trained for it and it's implemented rightly at the grassroots level. So that's a very interesting thing that you've talked about. So I think considering your military experience, what kind of human rights violations have you observed in these conflict zones, basically? Rahul, this person's coming.
Yes, I've removed her. I've removed her now.
Yes, please.
No worries.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Well, Yeah, you made the point about my military experience, so it's probably good to frame up front that my career background has been in the military for many years. That's sort of the experience I brought to that, along with obviously my experience studying and working in the law, and in particular focusing on issues to do with international humanitarian law and international human rights law.
Right.
With that in mind, in considering sort of the types of violations that I've observed in conflict zones and so on, I guess you've really got the full spectrum of violations that occur within conflict zones. I think that, in that respect there, what you see in terms of violations that occur in other types of environments where you perhaps have peace and you do have a level of peace, or alternatively you've got crisis, or you've got natural disaster, or you're experiencing an epidemic or a pandemic, or alternatively at the extreme end, when you're talking about armed conflict, what you do see is the extent of violations to occur across that spectrum of human rights, both civil and political rights, but also economic, social and cultural rights.
Right.
What I would observe, though, is that in terms of armed conflict, what armed conflict does, in much the same way as we've seen with the pandemic, where in the pandemic, issues to do with people's rights and the realisation of rights have been further challenged. The same thing happens in armed conflict. So those existing inequalities that are out in societies, the challenges that are faced, the violations that are occurring are only exacerbated and accelerated by the presence of armed conflict. And so that's sort of the what observation I'd make there in terms of that. And clearly, of course, when you're talking about armed conflict, the conditions are really set for people who perhaps would seek to take advantage of that situation, or alternatively would seek to do others harm, to be able to really jump upon that opportunity and be able to pursue that opportunity with perhaps a belief that they've got a level of impunity to be able to do so.
Right.
So in armed conflict, one of the challenges, of course, is that so much is happening within perhaps a particular area, and there may actually be small localized conflicts occurring within the larger perspective of an armed conflict, and that makes things challenging as well. So if I took an example of this, if I pointed to the armed conflict in Syria, and I talked about that, it isn't just one armed conflict occurring. There is indeed multiple conflicts occurring within the one geographical location. So you have conflicts between the Assad regime and those who oppose him. You have conflicts between that interdispose Islamic State. You have conflicts with Kurds as well. So there is multiple levels of conflict there, and really to unpick all of that, what you realise is with that level of complexity comes additional opportunity for rights to be violated, and additional challenges for those who seek to try and provide for people's rights to be able to do so. And, ultimately we have to accept that it's the responsibility of nation states, or alternatively, in the case of non-state actors that are controlling a particular area and operating as though they have a capacity and a capability like a nation state, it's their responsibility to be able to provide for people's rights. And so obviously that becomes challenging in the context of armed conflict to be able to do that, not only from a humanitarian perspective, but also just from a perspective of actually dealing with the true nature of warfare, which can be pretty brutal and unforgiving.
Right. Perfect. And I also feel like your military experience only ends up being a very big added advantage, whereby your experiences end up helping you understand what kind of frameworks required for the kind of work that you're doing. And it gives you an added lead in how you're supposed to tackle those situations in case anything comes up, and what kind of training you need to give to these people that come there. So I understand.
I think it adds a level of credibility when I'm talking with military people, because military people know that I've walked in their shoes, and I can talk their talk, and they understand that I can communicate to them in ways in which it makes sense for them.
Exactly.
But I think it also means, so just to sort of clarify, I've had experience in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, and across the Middle East, Iraq, and so on and so forth. So I guess from that perspective there, what I'm able to draw upon from all of that is to, when I talk about this in, say, a context of a discussion like this, or when I'm talking with students, or I'm working with colleagues within the UN at a more strategic level, I'm able to explain what it's really like at the grassroots level. I'm able to explain how perhaps military people are thinking and what they're doing. But I'm also able to do the same in the alternate to military people on the ground.
Yes.
And be able to explain to them in their terms.
Yes, yep, please. Yep. I feel like you have the best of both worlds. Like, you know, the mindset of the military people, and you also working with the international law affairs people, you know the mindset of them, and you know how you're supposed to balance between all of that and make sure that, you know, things progress exactly the way we want in terms of the solution. So I think it's best of both worlds. Right.
Yeah, certainly try. So it doesn't always lead to success, but it's worth the effort.
Yeah, perfect. And I mean, like, even in terms of the instances that you might have witnessed, which could be related to the prisoners of war, or it could be related to the torture that happens to these people, or even the exploitations, which could also be like sexual exploitation and abuse, which could be to men and women both, and children. So I think that gives you you're at a very good position to figure out as to how things have to move on to the next level. Yeah.
Indeed. Look, and from my perspective there as well, what I saw mostly in terms of what motivated me to sort of to change my career track from a military professional to then work in issues to do with human rights and peace and security was actually witnessing issues to do with conflict-related sexual violence, and particularly targeting women, young girls and young boys. And so I found that quite confronting. And so that's what actually motivated me on a personal level to want to start working in these issues, and really motivated me towards understanding more about the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, gender equality, addressing conflict-related sexual violence, addressing sexual exploitation and abuse, looking at how we frame child protection and protection of civilians as well.
Exactly.
And that came from that experience, that practical experience of seeing that, not from my own colleagues, but I had seen that from as a UN peacekeeper working in a peacekeeping environment and observing both state actors and non-state actors actually commit acts of conflict-related sexual violence against the people that they were actually charged to protect. And I found that very confronting, and it didn't sit well with my ethics and my morals. And I felt there was really two things I could do about that. I could feel sorry for myself, and sorry for those who I'd seen that committed to. And probably that would be a negative experience, or I could take it and turn it into a positive, and I could then try to work against that and really work at issues across the spectrum of strategic, operational, and tactical issues. And so that's kind of what I've tried to do. So that's why I sort of I use that as motivation to keep working towards these challenging tasks. You know, really those people who I've had a chance. Well, unfortunately, they're the people who motivate me, who keep me motivated, because really at the end of the day, it's real people and who genuinely suffer, and that's what we have to kind of work to address.
True. I mean, like, exactly. I feel there's a lot that you've already answered in the next question, but I'll still put it across. What kind of violations were specific in terms of gender? I mean, you've talked about it, but if you feel there's something more you want to say, then it's okay. Otherwise, we can proceed to the next question.
That's okay. Look, I'd say that, but certainly when it comes to certain violations, are gender specific. I think when it comes to anything to do with sexual violence, that is a gendered violation. A gendered crime in terms of who commits it, who it's committed against, and under what conditions, from a societal perspective and an operational perspective, is it done. And so I would put you that, you know, certainly issues of sexual violence, when we're talking about sexual exploitation and abuse, or whether we're talking about domestic violence, or whether we're talking about conflict-related sexual violence, all those issues are issues of sexual and gender-based violence. And I use that term quite specifically because clearly sexual and gender-based violence implies that there is a gendered aspect to those types of violations against the person. And so that is certainly a really easy one to pick up. But I'd also say to you as well that that, you know, just more broadly, when you talk about, say, for example, targeting of civilians in the context of an armed conflict, where civilians are deliberately targeted, they're not just targeted based upon sexual violence. They can also be targeted based upon an idea that if you can displace people, if you can push them out of a location, you can create insecurity, then you can really sort of attack the heart and will of people to rise against you. So in that perspective there, I would say that there is a gendered aspect to that.
Right.
Particularly in some conflicts where perhaps the gender norms in that conflict suggest that that males or men are the ones that go out and do fighting, and that women and children stay at home and look after the home front by no longer targeting those who are directly participating in hostilities, but by targeting those civilians behind that. There is a gendered aspect to that, and you really are targeting, in some contexts, women, girls, and young boys. So that could be another example. I guess a third example, and probably the last one I'll offer, is when we start talking about child soldiers and the use of child soldiers. That can be quite gendered as well. What we predominantly see is, in terms of child soldiers, is the use of young boys. To be forced into being child soldiers. So again, there's a gender aspect to that as well.
Right. Perfect. And exactly, like we see, like even in the international criminal justice aspect, we haven't seen too much accountability given in terms of reparations to these victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And it again ends up showing that there's still so much work that needs to be done in this aspect. It's just a starting point. Absolutely. Okay. What kind of trainings do UN peacekeeping forces undergo so that human rights are not violated?
Yep. So I'll talk to perhaps what troop contributing countries undergo in terms of their training when they're going to deploy large bodies of troops to UN missions, because I think that's probably one of the ones you're probably most interested in. The vast majority of people in UN missions are from troop contingents, and so that covers off on them. So look, there is a core pre-deployment training materials that exists, and this is aimed at providing essential knowledge to peacekeeping personnel to be able to work effectively in peacekeeping operations. And so the types of training that they receive from that perspective from the UN provides the standardised materials, and then that's delivered by the member state to their personnel. So you're talking there about things to do with principles of peacekeeping, principles of the UN, what peace and security really means, the legal frameworks that exist around peacekeeping, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law, for example, issues to do with peace building, modules on human rights, conflict-related sexual violence, protection of civilians, child protection and children in armed conflict, women, peace and security agenda, core values of the UN are taught, issues to do with respect and diversity within the UN system, the basic requirements for conduct and discipline for UN personnel, sexual exploitation and sexual abuse issues, which links into conduct and discipline. Safety and security is also taught as well, in terms of how safety and security can be provided for and by contingents. Now that's just what the UN mandates as a requirement to be taught prior to a peacekeeping deployment. But there are obviously member states, depending upon which member state it is, will also depend upon additional training that they will do. And that really comes down to a case-by-case basis, because it will depend upon what those troops are being tasked to do, in what mission they're being tasked to do it, as to then how they will design that training. So, if you're deploying a communications organisation to be able to be in the UN mission to deliver communications, they may receive different training in terms of how to run the communication systems and what that exists in the UN structure, versus if you are deploying an infantry battalion who is tasked with providing protection to civilians and doing patrolling, and they will do different training as well. So that's in that respect there. That's a matter for member states to adequately prepare those persons to deploy. But in terms of the standardised materials, sort of just touched on the major ones that people receive training in. So if anyone's interested to read that is available in open source. So if you were just to do a Google search for core pre-deployment training materials, CPTM for the UN system, you'll be able to bring that up on the UN website, and then that would be available open source, so it is publicly available. You can read all about in further detail. You can actually even download the modules and go through them if you really wanted to, if you're that interested in it, for those who are out there listening to this.
Right. Thank you so much. But I also had a question. Like, I feel these UN peacekeeping forces, I mean, like, everybody ends up seeing so much of, I mean, like very cruel things that happen. So it's like they end up seeing so much of that. And are there any modules that also end up considering the mental health of these peacekeepers, and like how they end up tackling that trauma that they get to see through all of that, all the incidences that end up happening on the war zones?
Yeah, there are. Look, there are a number of modules I didn't touch on here.
Okay.
I mostly focused upon the modules that were to do with how peacekeepers would interact with the host nation or the local population.
Right.
So, but there are indeed other modules that relate to how peacekeepers look after themselves. So they have a module, for example, on HIV and AIDS prevention. They have a module as well on physical well-being and health and physical security. So there are a number of various modules there. So, yeah, no, definitely that is. I would say as well, though, that there is a requirement on behalf of the member state who's contributing those troops as well to be able to also provide for that. So in the context of, say, I can only speak for Australians, but in the context of Australians, there is a fairly robust system of training for mental health issues. That said, mental health will always be a challenge for anyone who's been exposed to armed conflict, whether that be a peacekeeper or somebody who's directly participating in the hostilities, or indeed the civilian population that's living through it. So I think mental health is a significant challenge really across the spectrum of life. So, and it's great that you asked that question, because I think it's something that probably doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, and I think, yes, and that's something that needs equal emphasis. True, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Your thesis was based on sexual violence in non-international armed conflict. What kind of lacuna does international law presently have in terms of ascertaining accountability to such crimes?
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I want to start by, I guess I always think about conflict-related sexual violence, or sexual violence in general, based upon actually a quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And so he actually said, like, sexual violence is a threat to every individual's life, of dignity, and to humanity's collective peace and security. And so I guess if we frame sort of every discussion around sexual violence, and in particular conflict-related sexual violence, around these ideas of dignity, humanity, and peace and security, then we probably can't go wrong. In that respect, there, my observation when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence is, I guess, probably to talk about how we frame conflict-related sexual violence, and that's, I think, where there is that gap in international law as to how we might better address issues to do with conflict-related sexual violence, and in particular in acts of non-international armed conflict. I think it might be worthwhile just quickly to touch on what I mean by conflict-related sexual violence, and also what I mean by non-international armed conflict, because those definitions are important, and that's certainly what my thesis focused on. But in that context there, conflict-related sexual violence is when sexual violence the type of sexual violence it relates to is really rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, enforced sterilisation, forced marriage, or any other form of sexual violence that's of a similar gravity. And that could be perpetrated against men, against women, boys and girls. And it has to have some sort of nexus or linkage to a conflict. So it's going to be used to achieve a political ends or a military ends. And in that case there, UN Security Council Resolution 1820 is a pretty key one, because it defines conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of warfare. So in that context there, what we're talking about here is, if you want to use it as a tactic, then what you want to do is inflict long-term trauma and humiliation against people. You want to fracture families, and the social fabric around a society or around a community. You want to also, and I mentioned earlier about triggering displacement, but certainly sexual violence is used to be able to trigger displacement, so pushing people off and either then turning them into refugees by forcing them to cross an international border, or alternatively having them being internally displaced in the country of their origin. And it also fuels the activities of armed actors as well. So, you know, if we look at, for example, again, the conflict against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and we think about the sexual violence perpetrated against the Yazidi people there, you know, a border, you know, the particular targeting of that particular group of peoples, we can pretty much list off every single type of conflict-related sexual violence that I talk to being utilised by ISIS there, and they're utilising that as both a tool of recruitment, a tool to incite fear and terror, and a means of control, as much as it is a form of displacement. So we can kind of see how that sort of how that framed in those monumental consequences for the use of such violence. But on top of that, we have to understand that not only are these violations of human rights law, these are violations of international humanitarian law. And so international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions of 1949 prohibit the targeting of civilians in the context of an armed conflict, whether it be an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. So these are clear violations of international humanitarian law as much as they are violations of international human rights law. I guess where I see that there is indeed some opportunity for the international community to be able to take further action to address the level of impunity that perhaps exists in terms of people who commit acts of conflict-related sexual violence, and that would be to frame the discussion in terms of a discussion around torture. In my thesis, what I did was to frame acts of conflict-related sexual violence as acts of torture. The torturous nature of using sexual violence, all of those acts I've just talked through already, to achieve those particular ends in an armed conflict, from my perspective, constitutes torturous acts.
Right.
The reason why I think it's useful to discuss conflict-related sexual violence in terms of torture is because of the universality of torture.
Right.
So, in terms of the universal jurisdiction of torture, torture is what they call a jus cogen in international human rights law. In that context, there it's a fundamental principle of international human rights law that torture is absolutely unacceptable, and therefore it's universally there's a universal jurisdiction there. Why that's useful is often because when it comes to, say, for example, the International Criminal Court and the way in which the International Criminal Court deals with issues of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, whether we're talking about war crimes or crimes against humanity, when it does so, it often has to be strategic about how it litigates. It's got limited resources, and it really only addresses the most gravest crimes against the international community as a whole.
Right.
And so in that context there, what that means is that often a lot of issues to do with sexual violence may not may not reach the threshold to be able to be dealt with by the ICC. And so, or if they are, it's gripped up in a whole bunch of things. But we've traditionally seen in a lot of international criminal tribunals, sexual violence has not been sort of the head of crimes that have been dealt with. And it isn't until we get to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that we start talking about the case of John Paul Akiescu and the first case in which we start dealing with sexual violence as a war crime and a crime against humanity. So in that context there, I think why it's useful to identify it as a crime of torture is it provides that universal jurisdiction. And so what that then would mean is that when a particular nation state is unwilling or unable to take action through their domestic legal mechanisms to address sexual violence in the context of armed conflict, the other actors in the international community, other member states, can apply universal jurisdiction and can perhaps provide an avenue for a level of criminal justice against an individual who perpetrates such acts.
Right.
Now, that's not necessarily going to mean that 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 person may ultimately, ideally that person would be charged and would then, if found guilty, have a period of imprisonment to sort of make recompense for those particular crimes. That may not always be the case, but if we frame it as torture, then at least it provides that avenue for people to be able to consider, for governments to be able to consider how they may go about actually prosecuting such crimes. And I say crimes because these things are not only violations of international human rights law, but they do indeed constitute international crimes. So I guess one of the challenges really around this issue to do with impunity has not only been the legal mechanisms to deal with it, but it's also being able to collect evidence and handle that evidence in conflict zones. That's really challenging. It's really challenging because particularly if the conflict is still ongoing, the ability for actors to be able to get in and to be able to collect evidence, to be able to handle the evidence properly, to be able to satisfy a criminal sort of level of evidence handling and collection is difficult, really challenging. And a number of actors face significant challenges in even just getting access to locations, let alone then being able to undergo forensic collection methods and undergo interviewing of victims and to be able to gather all that evidence and so on. So, there are a number of challenges in that respect as well, which perhaps, there are still challenges when it comes to sexual violence and to gathering evidence to be able to take criminal prosecutions forward, whether that evidence be testimonial evidence or whether that evidence be actual forensic evidence or other types of documentary evidence. There are challenges in peacetime to be able to do that. Then when you think about a layer and armed conflict, and that's because of social stigma, cultural challenges, institutional challenges around perhaps a lack of gender understanding, of cultural understanding, of equality within a society, and so all of those sort of things are challenging enough for us in a non-conflict environment. In a conflict environment, not only do we have that, but we've actually got the threat, or the challenge of actually getting onto the ground, getting into the location, and gathering that evidence. And so, that can be a real challenge. But I am heartened by the attempts, certainly by UNITAD, so the UN mission, or the UN special mission that exists currently in Iraq, that is actually pursuing or gathering evidence around crimes committed by Daesh. To look at holding them accountable. Those sort of international mechanisms are great. That's fantastic to see that's happening. I think that there is opportunity to be able to do that in other locations as well. I mean, if we think about almost every single location where there's been an armed conflict, I can pretty much tell you that there's been use of sexual violence in that conflict. So, and that's just instinctively to be able to tell you that, without having to pull out statistics for you right now.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Long-winded way of saying there's a lot to be done.
Yes. And exactly, I mean, even for these cases that have happened related to conflict-related sexual violence in the ICC, it all zeroes down to individual accountability, and that's where everything fails in the end. Even for the Bemba case, there was this whole committees that was set up in order to have proper research as to what kind of reparations are going to be given to these victims, how we can use transitional justice to, lessen the pain of these victims. But in the end, it all went into the drill. I mean, it just went down the drain because there was nobody that they could account it to. There was no individual that they could put the blame on. I'm that's also so complex in itself. And I believe for that, you really need to have a good investigation team. You really need to have, it's very easy for me to say that, but when you're doing it in the field, it's very difficult in terms of ascertaining that crime to just one individual and making him the culprit of everything that has happened, because situations are very complex and it's at a level that we don't even know, to be honest.
And to be honest, in my answer to you there, I hadn't even touched on ideas to do with truth and reconciliation mechanisms or other forms of justice that we can look at in terms of addressing conflict-related sexual violence. My answer purely focused upon individual criminal accountability,
Yep.
the challenges around that.
Yep.
I'd also say to you as well, with the ICC is often looking at really getting the big fish. And that's again, that comes down to their ability to their resource limitations they have, but also the gravest of crimes against the international community as a whole, and how they address those. So that's not a criticism of them at all. That's just the way the system is.
Right.
And I guess, with all of these things, we always try to balance, or at least I try to balance in my mind the way the world should be and the way the world really is.
Right.
And there is a delta between those two, and certainly, and that doesn't, that's a frustration that is the case. If we can work towards trying to close that gap, then that's fantastic. But that gap does exist, and the way the world should be and should operate is very different to the way the world really is.
Exactly.
I think as well, when it comes to sexual violence, to the criminal responsibility for sexual violence, sexual violence is something that is. I mean, it's absolutely prohibited, whether we talk about it in terms of armed conflict or whether we talk about it in terms of peace. To varying degrees within varying jurisdictions, there are slight differences depending upon which nation state you're talking about, and the way in which you would establish and prove sexual violence. But that said, it's the fundamental principle that we all walk into when we go into an armed conflict is we know that it's already prohibited conduct in a peacetime environment.
True.
Nothing changes when you step into a armed conflict. It still becomes prohibited conduct. But what it also then does is becomes a war crime, or alternatively, in the case of say of a crime or of a systematic targeting of a group based upon certain conditions, a crime against humanity, or indeed a constituent crime to the crime of genocide. So, I think what is probably most important with the discussion around framing sexual violence in armed conflict as torture is that we're taking it down from having to be dealt with at an international criminal level down to allowing individual member states' jurisdictions to be able to prosecute and try individuals for those particular crimes committed in the context of a conflict, and we establish a nexus to that through the idea of the universal jurisdiction for torture. So that's what I discussed in my thesis, and that's certainly where I think there is some opportunities with international law, and that's only one example. So there are no doubt many more opportunities in terms of how we may seek to address this. And it's useful to have conversations like this to draw those out, because I'm imagining that there's probably some people who are listening in there right now who are thinking, yeah, that's a good idea, but also I can think about this, and this, and why haven't you said this, and this? And I would put to them and say, look, it's not because I haven't necessarily thought about it, or because I don't think it would be a good idea, but it's perhaps just not what's coming to mind right now.
Absolutely. Yep. I feel you've also answered a little bit of the next question that I'm going to ask you, but I'll still ask it. Do you think all the issues that you've mentioned are the reasons why victims of conflict-related sexual violence have not been successful in receiving justice? You've answered it, but you can still,
Yeah, I mean, really, there are a number of issues. There are issues to do with collection and handling of evidence. And so those are sort of structural issues. There are structural issues in terms of that. So I would say, in terms of the systems that we've set up, whether they be at the international level or at the domestic level, those systems rely upon, establishing a burden of proof of beyond reasonable doubt. To be able to convict an individual of a crime and then be able to put them into jail in a broad sense, and that then inherently requires that evidence be collected and handled in certain manners to be able to be admissible before a court and so on. And there has to be that framework and that structure that exists. And there are deltas between, and it's a bit of a patchwork as to how that sort of that system is and where it is. And to be honest, it's I guess it's true to say that depending upon where in the world you may have the the sexual violence committed against. So where in the world is it that the sexual violence is committed? Against whom is it committed by? Committed against, and by whom? That will influence probably the likelihood of an outcome for justice.
Right.
That is a pragmatic and perhaps depressing thing to say, but I would put to you that it's also true. Right. I guess from beyond then sort of those sort of structural issues to do with addressing sexual violence, there is also then those cultural issues as well. And we shouldn't discount those. So that is, the stigma around sexual violence within that an individual might have for themselves, and how their likelihood to be able to come forward, their likelihood to feel like they're going to be believed, their likelihood to feel like they want to put themselves through a process, whether that be a criminal trial or some sort of other mechanism that enables them to receive some sort of level of compensation for the crimes committed against them. Then there is the sort of the stigma that exists within a family, within a community, within a larger society. All of those things are things that we haven't overcome yet either. Layer on top of that issues to do with gender equality, and the fact that we have not realised anywhere in the world yet gender equality between men and women. That will have an impact as well on the ability to be able to address these issues. So I guess what I would say is that it's not just the structural, it's just not just the way in which the mechanisms that we utilise, but it's also the cultural context in which which we look to do that in. And in that context there, that then makes for a particularly challenging sort of environment. So I would say that it's unfortunate to say, but in the vast majority of cases, there are when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence, there is not an overwhelming sense that there is justice achieved for victims. There may be some header cases that as I said, that I pointed to. John Paul Akiescu is a key header case, for example, where we can say, okay, we're on the way, because here's the first time we've really talked about it and recognised it. We may then have UN Security Council Resolution 1820 of 2008, where it then says, it defines conflict-related sexual violence, and it actually specifically talks about how it disproportionately affects women and children, women and girls. And those sort of things are really important steps to acknowledge. But again, in terms of what occurs at perhaps strategic levels and what actually happens on the ground at a more tactical level, there can be a delta. Again, it's very similar to that, the way the world should be and the way the world really is.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for these questions. As it's already time that we have to round up the interview, but we'll have questions from the audience that we'll be taking.
Okay.
Yes. So let's go on with the questions. So we have Saman Kidwai asking, armed conflicts often lead to a reversal in gender roles and also results in the crisis of masculinity. Can you please address how these challenges further aggravate violence faced by women, including intimate partner violence?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. So what often happens in the context of any sort of armed conflict, any sort of crisis, any sort of significant existential threat is perhaps a reversal to sort of more traditional cultural gender roles in a society. And perhaps and there's many, if you look at the many articles that even point to COVID-19 and the impact the pandemic is having on the achievement towards gender equality. If we look at so that's also an important observation to make, and to make the linkage between those things. I think that in many cases what we see in environments is that it may be that in a particular culture that men are tasked with the responsibility of going out into fight as participating in hostilities, and that women may be tasked with taking care of the home environment. That said, that is a significant stereotype that is not always consistent, and that is not always accurate. Certainly in some armed conflicts, and if I look to, for example, the conflict against Islamic State, Daesh, women play an instrumental role within the apparatus of the Islamic State in terms of as both participating in the hostilities as fighters, but also in terms of facilitating the hostility as well. So, I will caveat it by saying that I am in some degrees here stereotyping, but not with malice in my heart when I do so. I'm doing it with the purpose of trying to demonstrate that you're correct. When there is a society where it goes through a level of upheaval, those issues, and I think I already touched upon it when I talked about the exacerbation of existing inequalities, and so intimate partner violence is certainly an issue for all societies, whether you're an Australian or whether you're in Australia, whether you're in Germany, or whether you're in other places in the world. Intimate partner violence exists, and so in that context, what armed conflict does is exacerbates those societal pressures, exacerbates the insecurity, and sets the conditions really for people to feel perhaps there's a greater level of impunity, that they're going to be able to get away with whatever it is that they would seek to do, that is particularly unlawful. And so I guess I frame it in those terms for you. That said, though, I'm not an expert on necessarily intimate partner violence and how that occurs within armed conflict, because that is in itself a sort of a really particular expertise as well. So my expertise is more in how it's utilised as how people who are directly participating in hostilities would utilise it for the purposes of targeting a civilian population. So, look, I hope I've answered that question at least to some degree, acknowledging that it's not entirely my level of expertise.
Saman, can you please switch on your camera? Saman? Yeah.
There she is.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Was that answering your question?
Yes.
Did I get sort of, yeah, okay, cool.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. The next question that we have is from Anushka Gaur. Anushka, can you switch on your camera? You can ask him the question yourself. That'll be a little interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Actually, my camera isn't working that well. That's why.
All right. You can audio. Yeah, cool.
Okay. So, sir, I just wanted to ask. I mean, a very insightful discussion we had. I just have a doubt that as you know, the Rwanda genocide was one of the most brutal genocide and most brutal human rights violation happened there the world has ever witnessed. So I was reading an article which talked about genocide detectives whose work is to primarily assess what exactly happened and assess the human rights violation and other aspects. So, sir, you also mentioned about peacekeeping forces. So does UN also fund such genocide detectives, and what role would they actually have if UN also does that?
Yeah, so look, it's a great question. I would probably point you towards, say, UNITAD. So indeed, this is the UN, basically the UN's investigatory capacity to investigate crimes committed by Daesh. So that's an example of where perhaps the UN has taken upon itself through resolution to be able to then develop an expert capability to be able to look at crimes committed in a particular conflict, and those crimes, may be crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and certainly consider issues to do with sexual violence as well. So that has been an example of perhaps where the UN has done so. Look, there are, off the top of my head, I can't think there are indeed, so the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda is created under a UN resolution, but then is stood up as a separate entity, and obviously appoints special investigators in that context to be able to investigate crimes committed in Rwanda. It's the same thing for the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia. They do something similar, again, resolution by UN to establish this mechanism. But then those individuals then who are investigating will be doing so on the basis of supporting that particular mechanism. Investigators work within the International Criminal Court, which is a component of the United Nations system, and will investigate crimes relating to genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, being the 4 things that are within the jurisdiction of the ICC. There are other, in terms of UN peacekeeping missions, the peacekeeping mission itself generally, and I'm speaking more generally now from my understanding, generally doesn't have investigators who are necessarily investigating great acts of genocide, for example, like the example of Rwanda. What they do have, though, is always a human rights division that actually is seconded across from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And what they will do is they will investigate and record and report upon the violations that are occurring within an armed conflict. In this case here, the UN being a neutral party, and the UN mission, for example, being the neutral party and observing and monitoring and reporting upon those particular things. They will also take information that they collect from civil society actors as well. So there are civil society actors out there who will also be monitoring the situation, who will also be investigating and reporting and recording, allegations of a variety of different types of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. So that is those aspects that are how that's dealt with. I guess what would be important to note is that the world said after Rwanda and after the former Yugoslavia and the genocides that occurred in both those conflicts, that we would never again would we have that situation. When we talk then about, and certainly something that's dealt with, is this idea about the responsibility to protect, and the idea that the international community accepts a responsibility to be able to step in when another nation is unwilling or unable to provide protection when acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing are occurring. That requires some level of investigatory capacity as well, but that will be a case-by-case basis. Yeah, I think I don't know if I've been able to answer your question in as much detail as you'd like, but the answer is yes, but it depends, and it depends upon how it is. And I guess in that respect, investigations at the end of the day, they're a response mechanism. They're not. They would have. There's some level of prevention in that if you investigate and then you can find someone criminally accountable, that might discourage others from committing acts. But primarily, they're response mechanisms. And ideally, that's important to make sure we adequately respond, but I think it's even more important to make sure we can prevent. And that's mostly what UN peacekeeping missions look to do, through protection of civilians, through child protection, and through an implementation of the women, peace and security strategy within that mission. So they're really aimed at sort of that prevention of the atrocities in the first place. That's where the vast majority of persons are focused.
Thank you, sir. That answers my question.
No worries.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for answering. Saman, please could you?
It's me
up?
again. Right.
Yeah.
So my second question essentially talks about what you had previously mentioned, how sexual violence is often used as a tool to target a particular group. And you've also spoken about the Syrian example. And in Syria, the Assad regime and its allied forces, as well as the Turkish forces, have been accused of committing this war crime in order to initiate what we call demographic engineering. So can you just perhaps elaborate on that and talk to us about how the aggressors often inflict such crimes on a vulnerable section? I mean, Bosnian example is yet another crucial example where you can compare, but Syrian, because it's a more recent case study, it's a prolonged war. Perhaps you can touch upon that.
Yeah, look, I'll be honest and say I'm not familiar with the exact use of it by the Assad regime. So I'm more familiar in the context of the conflict of the various conflicts occurring in Syria with the use of sexual violence by Daesh. But that said, on a broader level, when you utilize sexual violence, I mean, there are vast ways. I mean, we talk about forced abortion. And that's a way in which we can really target individuals and and really target the particular type of group, and I guess socially engineer. Forced pregnancy is another way in which you can do that as well. And it's not something that is, unfortunately, it's not something that is new. I mean, if we look back to the Second World War and we think about the ways in which forced abortions and forced pregnancies occurred throughout that particular conflict, we would see something similar. I guess the Syrian conflict is a particularly challenging one, and it's particularly challenging. And the reason why I say that I'm not really up to speed on everything that's being done there is because so much is being done, and it's difficult to keep a track of exactly which violations are occurring by what parties and so on. So I'm cognizant that in this case here as well. One of the challenges you may have in terms of the Syrian conflict and generally is that if you look at, if you understand the realpolitik of the world, you understand that that the Security Council and the permanent have perhaps been reluctant to criticise the Syrian government in the context of that armed conflict for reasons that you can probably track the reasons why. So that in itself is really challenging because that the entire UN system is set up upon the idea that that generally people will operate in good faith, and it requires, and it certainly invests special powers in the P5 members to be able to look at issues to do with international peace and security. And so it becomes a real challenge from an international perspective, when you've got conflicts where there are vested interests on behalf of those P5 members. But I suppose if you want other good examples of where sexual violence is being used in a more contemporary sense, you should certainly look to some of the conflicts in Africa. Certainly the conflict in South Sudan, the conflict in Darfur, in the Sudan. You should look to Democratic Republic of the Congo, to CAR as well, Central African Republic. So all of those particular conflicts, there is inherent use of sexual violence against peoples. In the context of some of those conflicts as well. You see a significant amount of young boys that are being targeted for acts of sexual violence, particularly in CAR in the Congo. I would also say as well that there's, in the conflict in Afghanistan, there's been sexual violence utilised or perpetrated in that conflict as well. Some more prevalent examples of that. But if you looked at you put up a map of the world and you looked at a heat map of where there has been conflict-related sexual violence used, you would find that there is a significant proportion of that across those areas we've just discussed. Look, I'm sorry I can't give you much better answer.
All right, but thank you so much. This has been very insightful. Thank you.
No worries.
Hasiba. We have a question from Hasiba. Is she there?
I see her. I see her there, but I think she's got her camera turned off and she's on mute at the moment.
Do
you have the?
Yeah, even I see her, but
Maybe you can ask the question for her.
Yeah. Yep. I'll surely do that. Hasiba. Okay. She said, "Thank you so much for giving a valuable insight." Her question is, what do you think is the main factor for all these conflicts? Do you think it has taken more of a religious shape rather than being related to political power? I mean, that's her question.
Yeah, okay. Look, I think it'd be very difficult to contextualize all conflicts upon on similar lines. And conflict is not monolithic. There's no one reason why conflict exists in various areas. So I think we need to break down every single individual conflict and then look at the causation and effect of those conflicts to understand that. And indeed, that's an area of practice. Again, that in itself is a very, very specialised area of practice, and most people who are experts in that focus upon one particular area. But what I would observe is that generally, and the way I like to think about conflict is through a sort of a human security approach. So I think about conflict in terms of whether there's freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from indignity. And I look at those things that perhaps are the drivers of conflict. And when I say freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from indignity, those key aspects of human security, I'm really talking about whether or not we can satisfy at an individual level basic needs. So if we talk about Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs, we talk about physical security, shelter, potable water, reliable food sources, sanitation, access to healthcare, economic opportunity, educational opportunity. You know, a lack of those things, I think, is certainly a driver of conflict. I would also say as well, that's from a bottom-up approach. From a top-down approach, I'd also put to you that there is indeed, in terms of peace and security aspects in the world, international peace and security, there is indeed political conflict that occurs. There is challenges over sovereignty or the exertion of sovereignty, access to resources, also just long-standing feuds, distrust, dislike, cultural conflict, insofar as different cultures not understanding each other. There is an aspect, I think, of racism within conflict as well. There is an aspect of sexism and toxic masculinity within conflict. And I think as well, I would also put in there are aspects of religion within conflict. But all of those things are, part of what is broader cultural considerations, right? So it forms part of that. And I think all of those things, and nationalism, I guess I haven't mentioned as well. So look, I guess what I've said to you is that actually I don't think it's one thing. I think it's a combination of all those things. I think it's a bottom up, I think it's a top down, and I think it's coming in from the sides. And I think it really depends upon the individual conflict. And really, if anybody can purely break down and look at one particular conflict and be able to really articulate all those causations and effects for that, and that in itself, I mean, that's a PhD in itself. That's a significant body of work, probably more, because even if we look to, say, for example, the conflict in Afghanistan post 2001, and we think about the various layers of that, I mean, that in itself, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of non-state actors involved. There's a lot of state actors involved. There's a lot of vested interests. The reasons why Australia is involved with NATO ISAF and NATO Resolute Support is different from the reasons why the United States is different from the reasons why the UK is, and various other countries that are involved in those NATO missions. It's different from the reasons why the Afghan, the Islamic, the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan itself is involved in the conflict. It's different as to why Taliban is involved, why Al Qaeda in Afghanistan is involved, why the Haqqani network is involved. So there's all of these various networks and so on, and they their intents and purposes may align or they may conflict at various times throughout those conflicts as well. So I guess peace and conflict studies is in itself a discipline within studies, and it's certainly not my area of expertise as such. Obviously, I focus around sort of those aspects of human rights in the context of armed conflict, peace and security. Look, I think I hope I've given you at least some food for thought, but I don't think I've really answered your question, except to say it's everything.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I got it.
Cheers.
Thank you so much, Hasiba. Thank you for answering the question. Okay, now we're taking the last question for today, and it's by Nivedita Shankar. Nivedita.
Hi, sir. So I don't, I'm going to give it as a disclaimer. I don't come from a very pure policy background, but what I am looking to understand is, would classifying conflict-based sexual violence as torture and giving it universal jurisdiction, would it by any chance fast-track the reparations and rehabilitation to victims by classifying it as probably emergency relief and not necessarily looking at accountability? You spend years in looking for one person to pin the blame on, right? Would that eliminate the process, or is that process still going to remain and you would not put it under emergency relief?
Yeah. That's a great question. Reparations for 4 acts of, say, conflict-related sexual violence are in itself a very challenging discipline of how we may look at reparations and how they're paid and in what manner they're dealt with. But yeah, absolutely. In that context there, if we look at framing conflict-related sexual violence in context as torture, there is indeed then additional mechanisms that come into play to look at being able to receive reparations for those acts of torture. So that is true. In my thesis, I focused upon the criminal responsibility for individuals to be able to be dealt with through domestic criminal systems to that universal jurisdiction. But yes, you are correct in observing that in terms of other mechanisms for other types of reparations, there would open up additional avenues. Yes, so would be my upfront statement to you. Without really, to be honest, it's that's not my area of expertise. So if anything I say beyond that would just be I wouldn't be confident that I'd be able to confidently tell you that what I was saying was 100% accurate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Mr. Tyson, do you have any closing comments to give for this whole event?
I just look. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all. It's fantastic to be able to get such passionate people, who really care about these issues, to be able to sit around and discuss this. And I recognise as well that for the vast majority of people dialing in from India, it's it's evening your time. So to take the time out on a Thursday evening to listen to me is it's very humbling to think that that hopefully we can have a good conversation and we can both take away things from each other. And having a chance to read about what you guys are doing and the issues you're dealing with and talking about, and knowing you're going to come and talk about internally displaced persons coming up as a next for the presentation, all those things are really inspiring. To think that that when I was younger and at university and my late teens and early 20s, I didn't have that same world perspective that you have. So I'm excited and energized by that, and really motivated and inspired by the fact that you all do, and I think it's fantastic. And I would, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn when I say that, knowing that you're going to get a presentation about internally displaced persons, I would ask you also to think about, when you're receiving that next presentation over the coming days, that you think then about how conflict-related sexual violence and the use of sexual violence contributes to that displacement of peoples in the context of conflict. So because that'll be you've got an important head start now into understanding the challenges that people who are internally displaced do face.
Right. Perfect. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you, Mr. Tyson. And I would like to thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with all of us on the theme of human rights in conflict zone amidst your busy schedule. I'm sure that all of us have learned a lot from this talk and have received a lot of information that we can ponder upon. I also thank the audience for being a part of this event, and good evening to everybody, and have a great day or coming weekend after the Friday.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.